Good afternoon, actually good morning, and thank you everyone for joining us at the Civic and Community Empowerment Session at the State of the People for 2021. Today we are presenting on We Rise, and there is no more fitting time for us to talk about the subject of Black women and girls than today at the beginning of at the beginning of National Women's History Month. So today we are going to be speaking about the plight of young girls and women in New York City and across our state. We are gathered here with some phenomenal organizations and phenomenal women who have been in the fight for social justice for some time. And also, we're hoping that many of you are pulling up to watch this panel as you also engage in various volunteer-led civic organizations. Before I announce the moderator, just want to introduce myself. My name is Jamaila Rhodes. I'm the Deputy Public Advocate for Civic and Community Empowerment. And I will also like to just give a quick shout out to the many organizations who have worked with us on this panel to make it a phenomenal discussion. We have the National Council of Negro Women, Brooklyn. Thank you, Carol E. Moore. We have the National Council of Negro Women, Midwood and Vicinity. Thank you, Glynis Cook. We have the National Council of Negro Women, Flatbush Chapter. Thank you, Karen Ellis. We have Educated Voter. Thank you, Nicole Yearwood. We have the New York branch of the NAACP. Thank you, Faraine Griffith. We have the National Coalition of 100 Black Women. We have the Black Women's Political Club. Thank you, founders Natasha Williams and Jamila Fines. Without further ado, I want to introduce the next person who will be speaking. Her name is Lurie Daniels Favors. She is no stranger to the work of social justice, and I am going to read her bio really quickly, and she will take it from there. Lurie Daniel Favors, Esquire, is an activist, attorney, and author with a long-standing commitment to racial and social justice. She serves as interim executive director at the Center for Law and Social Justice at Medgar Evers College. As a racial justice law, Medgar Evers College is a racial justice law center committed to addressing the needs of New Yorkers of African descent and the disenfranchised. Before graduating from NYU School of Law, as a Root Tilden Kern Public Interest Scholar, Ms. Daniels Favors co-founded Sankofa Community Empowerment, a nonprofit organization serving communities of African descent through culturally responsive education programs in New York and Pennsylvania. She later co-founded Breaking the Cycle Consulting Services, which specializes in preparing school communities to utilize culturally responsive teaching methods to increase academic achievement in diverse student populations. Now, Ms. Daniel Favors hosts the Lurie Daniel Favors Show on Sirius XM Urban View Network and uses her voice on the airwaves to highlight issues of social justice. She is the author of Afro State of Mind, Memories of a Nappy-Headed Black Girl, and a contributing author to The Birth of a Nation, Nat Turner and the Making of a Movement. Without further ado, I would like to introduce you to today's moderator for our discussion, and that is Lurie Daniels Favors.
Thank you so much for having me, Jamaila. And remind me next time to please send you the short version of that bio so that we can move into the substance of the day. I am so grateful and appreciative for the opportunity to spend this morning into afternoon with you, particularly because of the phenomenal, amazing women I'm going to be speaking with on this panel discussion today. And for time's sake, I'm going to dispense with a bit of the preliminary talk that we are often used to at these sessions, because I think the real meat of this conversation is going to come from the discussion we're about to have. And when we're talking about the state of Black women, the state of Black girls in the state of New York, in the city of New York, in the People's Republic of the United States of America, the reality is we are dealing with some stark areas of concern. We have seen a phenomenal amount of progress, but the reality is our girls, our women, women of African descent, girls of African descent are still facing a severity of need and a disparity in their access to resources and a disparity in the access to political power. And so I am thrilled to have the next two folks who you're going to be hearing me speak with come to the stage because they're going to help us figure this out. First, we're going to bring on Glinda Carr, Higher Heights for America, President and CEO. Those of you who know Glinda, you love Glinda. How could you not? She is amazing. And she is a national voice speaking to the needs for Black women to engage in electoral politics and does so quite successfully through a phenomenal Black woman-led organization, Higher Heights for America. And we also have Joanne Smith, Girls for Gender Equity founder. If you are not familiar with Girls for Gender Equity, you are missing out on part of why we are here today. You are missing out on a phenomenal resource, a phenomenal organization. They have been extraordinarily helpful to me in my own study as to what's happening with the state of Black girls and what's happening with women in our communities. And so I am so pleased to have both of them join me on this stage. Thank you both for being here.
Thanks for having us.
Absolutely. And I should say, we jumped right in so quickly. I forgot to give my thanks and appreciation to the public advocate. Thank you, public advocate. We appreciate you. We appreciate your commitment to this issue. We appreciate your commitment to the people of the city of New York. And we thank you for this day's worth of challenging topics and discussions and opportunities for further engagement. So I want to jump in. We have a short amount of time. I want to cover all the things in the world. So of course, we're going to be moving through this rapid fire. But I want to start, Glinda, with you. If you could give us, as it pertains to what's happening with representation, what is the current state of Black women in politics, and why is that so relevant for the 117th Congress?
Thank you to the public advocate for gathering us today for the state of our people. So the state of Black women in American politics. We've seen incremental gains in Black women's political representation, but we certainly as Black women put more into this democracy than we get back. Our trips to the voting booth in our organizing efforts to organize our house, our block, our church, our sorority, and our union to the voting booth certainly decide elections. It's what we've seen particularly over the last couple of election cycles, but 2020 we showed up and showed out as Black women, but we actually are not receiving our full return on that voting investment. And today we obviously are going to talk about that as it relates to the policies that directly impact Black women, our families, and our communities. And we certainly are still lagging behind in elected representation. So although we celebrate the gains we've made in 2020, right? We elected the first woman who happened to be a Black woman to the vice presidency. But that was at the sacrifice, frankly, of the U.S. Senate. So there's 0 Black women currently serving in the United States Senate. We've actually only elected 2. And it took 24 years between those 2 elections to elect the second one. And so that is a very stark example of a lack of representation. We have a record number of Black women serving in the House of Representatives. There are about 2.5% of that body. Black women are 7.9% of the population. So if you just talk about pure equity, inequality, and parity, there's still opportunities for Black women to serve in Washington. As it relates to other areas of government, we've never elected a Black woman governor in this country's history. We've only elected 15 Black women to serve in statewide executive offices across this country, Tish James being one of 5 that are currently serving. And we've seen Black women stepping off the sidelines in the spirit of Shirley Chisholm running for office, but there are obstacles, man-made obstacles, institutional barriers that exist for Black women who are interested in being elected to office, and that is, fundraising, navigating the political infrastructure, and a slew of discussions around narrative work. You never hear our counterparts, male counterparts, saying that they're not electable. And so there's work to be done.
Indeed. And as you are doing the work, I want to acknowledge the work of one Brandon Kazin Maddox, who is doing God's work by providing ASL interpretation and rapid fire speed. Yes, we're going to watch you thank yourself, Brandon. You're doing phenomenal. Thank you. And Joanne, as we're coming now to you, one of the things that I'm often worried about is we talk and we hear phenomenal women like Glinda who are able to lay out the landscape, what our current reality is. And sometimes we get so caught up in the current reality that we forget what we are actually fighting for. What are some of the issues that we are currently fighting for as it pertains to the quality of life and equitable political power for Black women and girls?
Sure. And first, thanks, Public Advocate, for having us here. Thank you for bringing us together. We're fighting for the lives of Black girls. So often, Black girls are an afterthought within, the political arena. Black girls are facing highest levels of criminalization as ever before. And currently, even during COVID, Black girls are facing and experiencing the highest levels of mental health needs, the highest levels of sexual and domestic violence and some personal violence in homes, the highest levels of suspension nationally, the highest levels of suspension within our state. Black girls are often seen as caregivers and often the fabric within families that allow for the essential workers that we love, right, during the COVID crisis, to be able to go out there and work because they take care of their siblings, they hold households together, they do gender responsive burden work, and oftentimes are not compensated for it. If we were to tally up the amount of work, I mean, think of yourself as a Black girl and, centuries of us doing work that was not paid for. I mean, we'd be owed so much more than a thanking women for saving democracy. We'd be owed, the real centering and the support of Black girls fiscally, but also educationally and in the culture, within policies that we pass. As we pass these policies, we have to be sure that trickle down policies that impact Black girls only if they impact their parents, that they impact them directly in the state and the development stage that they're in right now as young people and allowed to be young people.
It's funny, as you were talking, I was reminded of an article I was reading in preparation for an event a week or so ago. And it talked about the fact that since the pandemic has started, that there has been an additional roughly 3 hours a day of unpaid labor that parents are now taking on to maintain the household. Many of us are working from home. I myself have my daughter downstairs, and I'm hoping she's going to be occupied because her teacher today is sick. And as a result, at the last minute, she's doing asynchronous learning. I've got my son in his room, my husband, we're splitting the room, trying to see who's got access to the desk right now. There are all of these additional considerations. And one of the things the article spoke to was the fact that in most households, that it's women who are picking up that extra 3 hours a day of uncompensated labor. And it's not something that's necessarily borne out equitably. And I, of course, think about, well, what if you are a single parent? And often in our communities, it's women who are the single parents with custody of the children, full-time custody of the children. That uncompensated labor, which is labor that has to be done for the sake of the health of our families, is largely falling to women. And then you drill down and see how many young Black girls are helping parents to pick up brothers and sisters after school, or to tutor brothers and sisters when they're in the dining room and you're doing school in the living room. And this uncompensated labor is often falling on the
family. To cook for the family, to take care of their mother or father if they're sick. They are the ones who often get parentified, adultified, and step up. And it happens in every family, whether you have the nuclear family, you have relatives and cousins and aunties who have experienced this. And so, this has been the fabric of America for so long that it's time that it be centered and talked about. So I'm glad you brought that up.
Yeah, and I would love to add to that too, is that, Black women and women of color did not have the luxury ever to quarantine during COVID, right? And so March 8th was the last time that I went out and did something normal, right? I call it, the normal 365 days ago, right? It was, I'll just plug, March 8th was my birthday, right? So it is my birthday. And that was the last activity that Higher Heights did. And so to know that I had the luxury to be able to work from home, close office, and all of our team being able to work from home. But frankly, Black women and women kept this country open, the vital services. And we're still fighting to ensure, and that was them stepping out, still working, and then figuring out how to remote learn, take care of someone else in their family, as Joanne said. And it is what do we need to do to create personal sustainability, economic stability, housing stability for Black women moving forward, as we reimagine what beyond 2020 looks like.
And I think that reimagining, I've not heard the word reimagine so often as I have in like the past year and a half. And the reality is our active imagination is what is going to lead us to freedom. And so marrying that imagination and what could be, what we could change with what is actually happening on the ground now, let's shift a bit to talk about the national agenda. There's the Equality Act. There's the Black Girl Bill of Rights. What are these pieces of legislation? What are these policy positions? And how can our communities connect to support and uplift them further? Joanne, let's start with you.
Absolutely. So the National Agenda for Black Girls really grew out of a commitment to shift the conversation among candidates running for president so that it would center cis and trans Black girls explicitly. And it would address their legislative and resource allocation needs, that these candidates would be forced to answer questions around how it is they're going to support the lives and invest in the lives within the budget and within legislation. And now we know we can't legislate our way through to freedom, right? But we know we have to hold the government accountable and invest in the lives of Black girls proactively, not as a reactive, let's fix the problem and engage in that way, but a proactive, let's invest in, absolutely fix the systemic issues, but then invest in the future and the lives of Black girls, especially knowing that Black girls become Black women, become Black adults. And these are the same Black adults who we are consistently thanking for saving our democracy. And so as we embarked on the National Agenda for Black Girls, we embarked on bringing on a steering committee of Black girls, specifically intergenerationally working with Black girls to name what it is that they need and what it is that they want to change within the federal government. And so we landed on 6 policy areas: expanding education, justice, and opportunity, healing, well-being, and reproductive justice, immigration and racial justice, because Black girls understood immigration as a racial and gender justice issue. I'm first generation Haitian, and I understand, and our girls understand what it's like to be displaced in this country and come to this country and feel as though you don't belong. Expanding democracy for young people, ending gender-based violence, and building a culture of consent. And really, with that, I'll hammer down on really creating comprehensive sexual education within schools. It's just blows my mind. We are still having this conversation and for demanding for New York City, New York State, and other states to have a comprehensive sex education, curriculum and practice, when we understand that sexual education helps to reduce gender-based, sexual-based violence. It helps to reduce then, or at least inform reproductive choices and ways in which young people will engage in sex and have that autonomy and make those decisions. And then, of course, passing a Black Girls Bill of Rights. And so the Black Girl Bill of Rights, I love, it is really a global and cultural narrative shift. The Black girls that we worked with, and we held a Black Girl Movement Conference in 2016 with over 400 Black girls. They were able to name that they know they were not thought of when the Bill of Rights in this country was being written up. Many of us weren't, right? And so they wanted to name what it is that represents their Bill of Rights and their rights to be as young people. And so they developed a 10-point Black Girl Bill of Rights that we want the government to take on.
Now, how do we uplift that? I know some people are hearing about this for the very first time, or they're thinking about, how do I get engaged? What is it that the audience can do to help elevate these 2 pieces of legislation or policy positions that really do impact all of us?
Sure. And so just to bring up the Equality Act, we know the Equality Act just passed, and we still need to have it passed in the Senate. And so with the Equality Act, I mean, that's legislation there that, is really basically codifying the rights of LGBTQ folks. It's a simple, very, again, clear act to say that your rights actually matter in employment and housing and credit and education and public spaces. And so as these policies and legislations come up, community must support them, and Black community specifically, right? Because we understand that LGBTQ youth are part of our family, are part of our community. I'm a queer woman myself. We exist. We always have been a part of this democracy and building this country. And so to secure our rights should be a basic mandate. That said, get involved by joining Girls for Gender Equity. You can go to our website, ggenyc.org, There are a number of ways in which you can engage in conversation, in thinking through how we connect these policies where you are, because we do work nationally, currently 8 other states, and working with young people intergenerationally where you are. We can provide you with blueprints. It's not just work with young people in place of adults, right? It's not just, use that same curriculum. Young people have a certain practice and certain needs and certain ways in which you need to set the table for them to want to be involved and for them to give you their best. And they have so much to offer. And so we can help with that if you want to do that in your state.
Absolutely.
And it doesn't have to be a whole organization. Just let me name that. It could be your niece, right? And understand that the way in which we're working is going to benefit everyone. I don't want to hear, what about the boys? The boys benefit too from this work. I promise you that.
I'm so glad you said that. A lot of times we uplift a policy and then we're sort of thrown off track with the whataboutisms. And well, what about the brothers? Brothers, you in there? Like we support.
What about white girls?
What about
Asian girls? We're talking about all our young people. I promise you that. And I promise you, if you center Black and Indigenous girls, you're going to get a lot more for all of our young people.
That's absolutely right. And I want to send love and appreciation to Nora, who is our new ASL interpreter. Hello, and we thank you for doing your work, and we get to enjoy watching you thank yourself, and we appreciate you and your work. Glinda, I want to bring you back in here because as we're talking about these issues on a national level, when we're talking about that national agenda, we can also think about the fact that COVID-19 has also had a national impact. What is happening currently with COVID-19 and its impact on Black women and femmes in the country? Oops, I'm going to need you to unmute. You're amazing, but we can't hear through a muted mic.
You would think a year in, you wouldn't be like, unmute yourself. So I do think, being a year in, literally a year into the global pandemic and us just being aware a year ago about what is this thing called, remember a coronavirus, COVID-19, the Rona, and having a diverse decision-making table, they make better decisions. So very early on, if you remember, Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley from Boston, U.S. Senator Kamala Harris, and U.S. Senator Elizabeth Warren and Cory Booker all drew attention to the fact that there was a racial disparity as it relates to COVID-19. And that disparity we were disproportionately affected by it from health perspective. The ability to have access to healthcare. We were dying at larger rates. We certainly, from the economy perspective, COVID-19 is more than a health pandemic. It was an economic pandemic for our communities. And so Black women found themselves having to navigate COVID-19 from all fronts, income insecurity, housing insecurity that led to housing insecurity, job insecurity, all while I don't have any children. So I don't know how y'all did it with the children, the babies at home, right? And now we find ourselves in the slow steps towards recovery. And find that COVID-19 vaccinations that Black and Brown communities are being disproportionately affected by how that distribution is happening. And so this is, I think, an example of being able to show a discussion around race and, frankly, gender, and the intersection of race and gender on an issue that is affecting everybody, but being able to show that there's very clear differences, negative differences, as it relates to race and gender and COVID-19. And so certainly Black women have started more small businesses. So we are more disproportionately affected by COVID-19 as a small business owner. Every piece of our lives and the way we want to show up. At the end of the day, Black women want economically thriving, educated, healthy, and safe communities. And those 5 kind of prongs, COVID-19 has touched each piece of that. But I also think that as we push innovation into policymaking and budget priorities, that coming out of COVID-19, as Joanne mentioned, we have to be advocates to ensure that many of the policies that were implemented from an emergency perspective become institutionalized, because there were things that were said that couldn't be done, but when there's public will and political demand, or political demand and public will, we certainly can ensure that we can talk about economic stimulus, turning that actually into economic drivers in our communities.
Joanne, I'm going to turn to you and ask if you could shed a little bit of light on what's happening with the impact of COVID-19 on the Black LGBTQ plus community. We oftentimes include these broad swaths, but we don't often have the time and space to drill down a bit. Are you seeing any particular impacts for the Black queer community that we need to be aware of so that we can also elevate those issues as well?
Absolutely. I mean, there was already impact on the Black queer community before COVID, but imagine for the last year, and as Glenda said, we're coming up on the anniversary when COVID shut the city down or shut the nation down. For the last year, we've witnessed Breonna Taylor murdered, George Floyd murdered, Tony McDade murdered, trans young person, and the consequences of our uprising and the consequences of a white supremacist attack on our Capitol, the consequences of an election and fear that we would have a fascist remain in office, and all while imagine being a child, a young person who has to remain in the house with their family, has to again do gender expensive responsibilities, and while you're watching family and friends pass away, you're watching the adults in your life leave, and you are afraid. As a young person who's queer, who may already have been kicked out of the house, we've seen a rise in police arrests of queer people. We've seen a rise of homelessness, a rise of loss of income and jobs that they once held, when they were having to take care of themselves. And of course, within schools, inconsistent school supports. There was a lack of counseling within schools already. And for young people who received counseling or school was their safe haven, to have to remain home, not receive the IEP services that they need, not receive the secondary school counseling and career support, and then being expected to perform. Could you imagine having to do this job, our jobs, without having the equipment we need from our jobs to be able to do it? And we're still expected to graduate these young people. We're still expected for them to go on to their next level of life and go to college and become adults. And so it's unjust. It's actually violent to expect that from young people, and especially young queer and trans folks.
I'm so glad you phrased it that way. It is violent. It is a violent assault on the person to be forced to live under those conditions, and to not have the resources that you need to navigate it. And whenever I think about resources, I also then think about civic engagement. At the Center for Law and Social Justice, we are a 36-year-old now Black women-led organization. Our founder was as committed on the day she retired last year as she was back in 1986 when she and Black activists and attorneys came together to create a law center that was going to focus on the needs of Black people. As we're talking about civic engagement, for better or for worse, and Glenda, I'm going to look to you first on this. We are often thinking or talking or discussing in terms of GOTV, get out the vote. Vitally important. You will not hear me ever again. I was foolish at one point in my youth, and I used to say my vote doesn't matter when I was young and dumb and uninformed. And now, I get it. I've had a complete change. But when we're talking about civic engagement, a lot of times we're talking about the vote as if that is the only way in which we are to be engaging civically. And we at the center are now thinking about where we're going to be launching our Civics for the People Academy to sort of broaden out our understanding of what it means to be civically engaged. If you have one election day in your community, that means there are 364 other days in your community that you can be civically engaged. What is a better definition of civic engagement than just focusing on get out the vote activities?
Great question framing. We say at Higher Heights is that democracy doesn't begin and end on election day, right? And in fact, it's a 365-day a year participatory activity, and that we're all civic leaders or political leaders, right? We often hear when you say political leader or civic leader, advocate, activist, that people think that we all went to school to do these things, right? It is something has connected. It's the generation. We're in Women's History Month. Like, I learned to kind of just do this work watching my great-grandmother, grandmother, and mother, right? My great-grandmother, who was born in, the late 1890s, who didn't have a right to vote, had a third grade education, couldn't own property, knew that the work that she did to advocate for her family outside of the voting booth, that she didn't have access to, actually created the trajectory for me and my brothers to be, her wildest dreams. And that being said, I mean, the public advocate Jumaane Williams comes from that tradition, right? This is the reason why we have a convening like this, is the state of our people, right? And that we all have a role, that we need to be active participants. And it could be from you calling, emailing, virtually visiting, or as we're starting to open up, lobbying and talking to your elected officials. The squeaky wheel gets the oil, right? And oftentimes when you watch the news, it's oftentimes you feel like you have to be the most powerful, the person with the most money to have access. When you squeak loud and you squeak as a community, our elected officials are actually responsive. And there's two things. We want to hold our elected officials accountable, but frankly, we also want to create the environment for our elected officials to push innovation and policies. And we need to be partners. Many of the pieces of legislation that Joanne was talking about, and I spent 6 years working in the New York State legislature as a chief of staff of Kevin Parker, is that a lot of the legislation you see has either been inspired by a real person and a real incident and a real problem, or that regular everyday citizens in dialogue with their elected officials help to shape policies and determine how budgets have priorities. And so I would say that in addition to thinking about running for office, because I'm always going to say that is not the only thing you can do as a civic or political leader, that those who are listening to us, like you could be the architects and the shapers of the next piece of policies that actually will benefit you, but will benefit your families, your communities, states, and frankly, nation. I'll give a quick example. The Crown Act. The Crown Act, right, is an act around hair discrimination, and was sparked by, one woman and a woman who had a conversation with a group of women who then had a conversation with several state legislators, and Holly Mitchell in California, state senator at the time, was the first to introduce it and passed it, and is moving from state to state. In my home state where I grew up, Connecticut just passed that last week. And that, again, was sparked by a person who's like, why can't I wear my hair the way I want to wear my hair? And I feel like I'm being discriminated against.
I'm so glad you mentioned the Crown Act. And I'm just, as we're all a part of the naturalista community here, in some way, shape, or form, we love someone who is. And what you rightly point out is that whether you're running for office or crafting policy, there is a role for all of us, because the Crown Act built on the work of Black women who were active in the natural hair community, who were saying, I should not be economically punished, i.e. can't keep a job because you don't like that my hair grows out of my head and reaches towards the sun while yours just simply lays. Nothing wrong with simply laying. As my daughter said to one of her friends last year, I wish you could do something more with your hair, because the young lady, one of her best friends, didn't have coily texturized hair. And my daughter's coming with braids and beads, and her little friend is just with the straight hair. A complete 180 from what I was experiencing as a child. But that shows you just how important it is that legislation and policy lines up with real live experiences. In the late 1990s, Black women in the state of New York were not allowed to open up natural hair salons. Legislation had to be drafted, and it was because of the work of my predecessors like Esmeralda Simmons, Diane C. Bailey, those giants in the community who said, you know what, we are going to write legislation that says Black women should be able to open up natural hair salons. And as a result, it opened up an entire economic pathway for countless numbers of women to be able to specialize and take cultural authority in our cultural elements and use that as a way to provide for their families. And Joanne, when I'm thinking about civic engagement, I know that it's showing up for young people in ways that are far beyond what I was thinking about when I was in my 20s. So, and although I'm still in my 20s, I'm, just a year or two removed. Are we all? Talk to us about how activism and civic engagement are showing up for the young people that you're working with, and how they are able to better center the experiences of queer folk in our community.
Sure. Well, first of all, language matters, inclusivity matters. And so our work, again, centers cis, trans, and gender expansive young people, as well as non-binary young people who don't subscribe to gender, young people who, are whole in themselves and their own gender identity, or not having a gender identity. So first, creating inclusive spaces where young people can see themselves also in history, understanding we are seeing these memes of Ruby Bridges, and our VP, right? And Ruby Bridges was a child during Brown versus Board of Education, and so necessary for that desegregation to happen. We see with the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing that Denise, Addie, Carol, and Cynthia, they made history that they didn't want to make, just like George Floyd just made history that he didn't want to make, and being able to pass legislation, passing the Civil Rights Act, and George Floyd's just now the George Floyd Justice and Police Act was passed. Understanding that, Claudette Colvin, we celebrated Claudette Colvin Day on March 2nd, the second day of Black Women's History Month, and understanding that, this 15-year-old is who helped, right, to desegregate the South. And so when we, name and talk about the Children's March, and young people are able to see themselves in history, they understand that they are part of this civic responsibility and engagement just by birthright, by being born. It's not something they asked for, it's something that came to them by them being part of the work because they are the work and come from a rich history of work. Within that, there are many ways to get involved, understanding that while they're not recognized as legal voters until they're 18, there's participatory budgeting. There's, of course, political education. A lot of political education has been done to parents, especially parents of first-generation students who, English not being their first language. A lot of political education around our city council in New York City. We're going to have 39 seats come up in our city council of 51. And so many people are running, and to be able to understand, why your parents would vote for them, or your family, your friends would vote for them. Understanding, even within the mayoral race, that 109 men in New York City have been mayor. Never has there been a woman, never has there been a Black woman or a woman of color within that seat. And so first starting with that political education, and then showing young people that there are many ways in which, whether it's a school board, whether it's a community board, that they can be involved, whether it's voter registration, that their voice matters. And right now, even with our budget in the state, we have a budget priority, a recovery for all planning that still ignores the simple needs of summer youth employment for young people, and the investment that we need that was originally meant to keep young people busy. Has been taken away because of COVID, and now needs to be restored, as opposed to 150 million being tacked on for the police. A state that said $1 billion would be deducted from police, tacked on 150 million more to the police budget. And so there are many ways that young people can speak out against this. There are testimonies that we're doing almost every day in New York City, but also to get plugged into their local politics and decide where it is, and try out, it doesn't have to be your lifelong passion, but try out, your voice and your ways and your tactics to be a part of the democracy.
Well, you wisely saved the call out for the budget for NYPD to the end. Had you mentioned that at the beginning, I might have been distracted and spent the entire rest of the time talking about that. It's a passion issue for me. And you noted that getting involved, there's an upcoming election. There are 39, is it 39? Yes, 39 city council seats available. It's going to be one of the largest turnovers in elected officials that we have seen in this city. We know that redistricting is happening right now. And for those of you who don't know what redistricting is, every 10 years, in the year following the census, all of the boundary lines around your community, whether you're Bed-Stuy, Brownsville, East New York, sorry to say Brooklyn centric, Jackson Heights, St. Albans, wherever you may be, the reality is all of the boundary lines for the districts that make up your communities are about to be redrawn. There is so much, we have ranked choice voting happening for the first time. And don't believe the hype. If you can play musical chairs, you can do ranked choice voting. The reality is there are so many opportunities right now that require, they are begging for our community to get involved, begging for the influence and the input of Black women and Black women and girls and femmes and part of members of our queer community. And it is so, I think, very important that we have a public advocate who has dedicated this time to centering some of these issues and giving us the platform to be able to talk about this in ways that I hope has been empowering for the audience. And so I see Jamaila here. I know that usually means she is playing the Sandwoman role on today's Black Women History Month. So I'm going to pass the microphone back. And I just want to say thank you so much to both of you for what you are doing nationally, what you are doing here locally. I read your reports. I follow your work. It informs the work we're doing at the Center for Law and Social Justice. It informs the advocacy that I choose to use my platform to uplift. So I personally thank you as a woman, as a mom of a woman and a son, a woman to be, and my son, a wife, someone who is a beneficiary of all of your work. I am just so grateful and appreciative to both of you. And so I thank you both for allowing us to have this conversation.
Thank you.
Deputy Public Advocate, we're going to turn it back over to you.
Thank you so much. This conversation and just listening to this fireside chat has been amazing. We thank you so much for everyone for watching and for adding your questions and your comments to the chat. We really appreciate you. We're going to turn over to the next panel, which begins at 12:30. And that panel will be on technology, innovation, and technology. So thank you for watching and have a good day.